Welcome to Master Your Merger, the podcast for leaders navigating the people side of mergers and acquisitions. Each week, your host Clint Kendrick talks with deal makers, HR leaders, and integration experts to uncover what really works when it comes to people, culture, and performance during a deal. From retaining top talent to aligning leadership, you'll hear real stories and actionable insights from the people doing the work, all designed to help you make your merger work. If you're leading through M&A, this is your weekly playbook.
Welcome to the Master Your Merger podcast. Today I'm joined by Mark Guidi, Managing Director of Operations and Transformation and Global Head of M&A Integration at IQEQ. Mark has spent more than 25 years leading complex operating environments across PE-backed and public companies, with direct ownership of large P&Ls, global teams, and high-stakes integration work. He's also the architect of the PACE framework, which reframes M&A as a disciplined, end-to-end operating model rather than a discrete transaction. In this conversation, we're going to explore how that transformation lens plays out in the real world and what it takes to convert a deal thesis into durable permanence without accumulating integration debt along the way. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here, Clint. Thanks for having me on.
No, it's my pleasure. So, Mark, let's start off with talking a little bit about you and how you got involved in M&A. So, how'd you get into the M&A game, and when did you start to see M&A as a transformation discipline?
So I got into the game a long time ago, actually. It was over 25 years ago. I was back when I was still in IT, and I was at a company in the Boston area, actually, that did scientific equipment. It was a $2 billion enterprise. They had a very large scientific equipment business and a small government services business. We got a new CEO, and he decided he wanted to flip the script. And so over the course of basically 18 months, I drove the IT piece, but there was a much broader effort. And we divested about half the business and then acquired another business of about the same size, so that at the end of it, we were basically 70% government services and 30% product. So we completely switched from a product business to a service business. And I was hooked. It was just so much fun seeing how everything came together, how you had to pull stuff apart, bring it together, how the different cultures went together or didn't in some cases. And so that's actually how I got into M&A. Turned out it was my first deal, which I didn't really even realize what I was doing, was very much a transformational deal because it truly flipped the type of business. That business is still, they've renamed it, but it's still in, I won't say the name, but it's still in business today. And they're doing great. So that's how I actually got into it. And once bitten by the bug, I ended up going into consulting and spending almost 10 years in the Big Four, helping companies go through large-scale change, transformation, and a lot of that was M&A related. So that's how I got into it. What I saw when I first got there was it was very transactional in a sense. It was very focused on the deal. A lot of companies, especially once I got into consulting, I found that a lot of companies, they do a deal here or there, but they never really built up the muscle. And it really wasn't until I worked with a couple of businesses in Silicon Valley, actually, that were what I would now call truly serial acquirers. They were buying dozens of businesses a year and were really good at this. But I saw the value of truly making it into a discipline that any business could do that, even if you're not buying dozens of businesses a year. And so that's how I started to see the value of that and kind of A, got into M&A to begin with, and then B, really saw the value of making this into a true business discipline, just like finance is or HR is or any other functional area in a business.
This is a fantastic story. A lot of businesses really do this portfolio realignment as they transform themselves. And I think it's an area that we don't necessarily talk enough about in this world. We tend to talk about serial acquisitions as if it's always buy, without a lot of conversation about how it can really change the nature of a business when you're also selling off parts of the business that may not be core to the future mission.
Well, no, that's absolutely right, Clint. And the reality is most businesses underestimate or underperform on the divestiture side. Once they acquire it, they bring it in, they hang on to it for dear life forevermore. And it's a really smart thing. Again, the companies that do this really, really well are always evaluating all of their parts of the business to see, does it still meet the thesis, the deal thesis, or the business existence thesis, right? The raison d'etre of a business, which can change over time, maybe not as drastically as the example I gave, but they do change. And so companies should always be not only on the lookout for acquiring businesses, but also which businesses might no longer be a fit for the future or in terms of where the business is going.
Yeah. There's a really good book out called The Granularity of Growth, which I definitely encourage folks who are trying to understand the business side of this. And over a period of time, they tracked businesses that did divestments, basically freeing up assets to pour back into the core business. And I don't know the stats off the top of my head, but they did significantly outperform their competitors who held on for dear life. So we'll drop a link to that in the show notes for folks who might be interested in checking that book out. But
That would be great.
speaking
I
of
wouldn't mind
books,
checking it out either. So I would love to see it as well. I have not heard that one, so that would be great.
yeah. So speaking of books, Mark, you
Yep.
have formalized your thinking about the PACE framework into a new book called Transform, a Leader's Survival Manual to Driving Change in the Age of AI. So tell us a little bit about what PACE stands for and why you structured it this way.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, so the book was just actually published, well, I guess technically 2 months ago, end of March. So super excited. That was six years worth of effort there to finally get that out. But the framework portion of it, and that's just a portion of it, but the framework portion of it is really focused around how to look at transformations. And there's tons of frameworks out there on transformations. The Loon model, the Cotter model, right? And you can go down the list. The reason I framed mine the way I did is because it is execution oriented. It's an execution oriented framework, not an academic one. So it doesn't describe how to manage change. It really describes rather how to actually do it. And so PACE, as you ask, is really just it's a 4-letter acronym because you got to have an acronym, right?
Right.
So it stands for plan, align, change, and embed. And each of those phases has 2 steps in it. So like in planning, you've got the step 1 is really envision, create your North Star in terms of where you want to go with the transformation. Or from an M&A perspective, it could be your deal thesis. Why are you even looking to do a deal, right? And then the assess is getting to know yourself. So that's the internal assessment, knowing where the business is strong, where we're weak. And from an M&A perspective, that's like thinking about where do we need to accelerate business growth, or where would inorganic growth be the most valuable to the business, right? So each one has 2 steps to it. And the focus and the point of the framework, so it's dynamic. It's designed to manage multiple major efforts simultaneously and at speed. So you could have different parts of the business in different parts of the framework, and it still all works together. And so that's another thing that makes it unique from a lot of the other frameworks. And so it's just another type of transformation. So M&A fits very nicely into this, as I started to walk through at the beginning there, in terms of the deal thesis, internal ability to support an acquisition, getting the leadership team aligned, building out a roadmap, et cetera. And so that structure for PACE works just as well for M&A as it does for any major business transformation. And it's practical, which is why I designed it the way I did.
That's good stuff. And I really appreciate the fact that it's got the possibility of being asynchronous, right? Because I think we see that in M&A integrations all the time. We like our really tidy 100-day plans, but the reality is that not everything can be done in 100 days, and candidly, not everything should be done in 100 days. So I think that's really smart. If you think about this as execution, right? Transformations being execution rather than strategy, I think that's a great lens. Where do you see things really breaking down in execution in the M&A context?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So first of all, there's whenever somebody asks me about this, there's always a quote that I really like from a very famous person, not necessarily known as a poet, but I love the man anyways, and it's Mike Tyson, the famous boxer. And so he had a quote that he's been widely attributed to that says, "Everybody has a plan when they step into the ring until they get punched in the face." And I love the quote because it's very applicable to business, right? You've got a plan on going into this deal until you actually get hit in the face with the realities of actually trying to make it come about. So if you think about a deal process, and there's lots of different versions of this. I use a 5-step process. It's pre-deal is step 1. So that's kind of thinking about where we want to go, what companies we want to buy, et cetera. Pre-close, that's all the due diligence and narrowing it down to one company and deciding, are we going to acquire it? Integration, and then harvest, which is once you own it, you're actually operating it, and then eventually divest. So think about those 5 steps. When you think about those 5 steps, what I've found is that most companies actually do a pretty good job of identifying their inorganic needs and being able to target companies that would fill the gaps of whatever they believe their need is. It's when you start to move into the pre-close phase, like the due diligence efforts, right, and the integration efforts, where things I find start to derail, right? A couple of very simple examples. How much is often missed in due diligence? Now, granted, there's access issues. There's only so much you can do, right? But oftentimes there are aspects of due diligence that are missed. So doing the financials is always hit upon, but there's the cultural diligence, which I may talk to that a little bit more later. There's the operations diligence, the technology diligence. There's a lot more to a business than just the financials. And so understanding that or in full is really important. And I've seen deals, I've personally blown up deals based on nothing to do with financials. There was a deal we did once for a large automotive company that was looking to buy a company in South Korea. And we were actually in Seoul. I got to spend 8 weeks in Seoul. That was awesome time, by the way. And at the end of the day, the company was good, but they realized they'd so underinvested in their IT infrastructure that it would have been hundreds of millions of dollars to bring it up to snuff. And it would have essentially derailed the business value of the transaction. So they walked away. So having that comprehensive view is important. And then obviously there's been more written about integration and how to do it. And, without detailed tracking of synergies, the value leakage and all that, there's so much written about that. I won't go into that now, but those are kind of the 2 areas where I see, M&A struggling the most. And so when you ask, going back to your question about why do I say they fail most because of execution, not strategy to me is the deal proposition. Why are we doing it? What company we're going to buy, et cetera. It's the execution part about once you get, quote unquote, punched in the face and the deal is real and you've made the acquisition, how do you actually make it work and maximize the value that you've just paid enormous amount of money, no doubt, for this business you just purchased, right? So that's what I mean by that.
Yeah, and I think we're of one mind there. When we look at the failure rate and it right now is hovering around 2/3. When we look at that failure rate, I honestly believe it's because we spend so much time in due diligence focused on simply legal and financial issues without asking ourselves, how are we actually going to make this thing work? That we miss all those signs and we end up with those surprise punches.
100%. Yep, 100%.
So other than missing out on that execution question, what are some of the other common mistakes that you see leaders making before a deal announces that end up causing problems downstream?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I would say there's kind of 3 of them that I would say are very, very common. I'm sure there's a whole plethora that we could go into, but I'll group it into three areas. The first one is the one I just referred to a minute ago, and that is treating culture as a soft topic to address post-close. And I'm sure you've seen this too, just given your knowledge and background personally, right? But culture diligence often gets like one slide or it's an afterthought. It's a few bullets, in a 100-page slide deck of determining, right? And then you get to day 30 and you discover that this company that you've just acquired, they're a consensus-driven company versus your company's being tops down or something different, right? And all of a sudden the best, your top talent's like, well, this is not really what I signed up for. And you start to, attrit talent. And so cultural diligence, and this is a little bit cliche-ish, but it really needs to be as rigorously performed as diligence on the financials. And with very specific decisions made pre-signing about which culture wins, where, who's got decision rights, et cetera. And so that I find is still to this day, even though, again, there's been an enormous amount written about it, an area that's quite often missed. The second area I will say that happens quite frequently is in the integration space. And it's the leadership of the integration, who it is and when they're named. And so I've seen two mistakes that companies consistently make. One, they just grab somebody, right? It's like, well, you've managed projects before. Clint, you could manage the integration.
Right.
Yeah, no. Project management is very different than integration management. And again, I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm not saying one is more skillful than the other. I'm just saying they're different. And so the fact that you could manage a project is one thing, but integration, you're literally got to work across the entire enterprise. You're bringing together whole functional areas, not just like deploying a system, right? Again, not trying to say one's better than the other. I'm just saying they're very different balls of wax and they require distinct skill sets. And so either picking somebody that's just, you're a good PM, so we'll have you do it, often doesn't work, and or not naming somebody early enough in the process. So I always insist, in my present role, and they didn't do this till I got here, but I insisted that I be brought in during the diligence phase. Not that I'm necessarily going to participate in diligence, but I want to see what's coming out. What are the findings so that we can start to bake that in to the plan? So we've got a standard work plan and a integration playbook, but every deal is unique. So every deal has a few things that are unique to it. I want to know those as early as possible so we can bake those into the plan. So that's kind of the second area is around the integration leadership. And then the third area I would say is really around synergies. Again, another area where I see people doing this quite often is they will overestimate the synergies, the benefits, so to speak, of the deal because they really want to do it and they want to get it approved.
Right.
And then all of a sudden they spend the first year just chasing numbers nobody really believed in because they came out of somebody somewhere, right? And that kills the morale and it crowds out the actual value creation work that's going on. So being true to the synergies and not getting caught up in the excitement of a particular company, but being able to kind of keep that professional distance to really evaluate what exactly you're getting into. So I would say those are kind of the three areas that I've seen the most in terms of mistakes.
Yeah, I think those are really, really good ones to point out. We're starting to see a trend, Mark, of more and more integration leaders actually starting to lead the diligence process, not just being involved. So the corp dev team is really strong when it comes to negotiation and the financial modeling. And in those more sophisticated acquirers, we're starting to see the integration team saying, hey, we'll actually lead the other parts of diligence so that we can sort out how we're actually going to make this thing work. And I'm curious if you have thoughts about that trend or if you've seen that yourself.
I have seen it a little bit. We don't do that at the company I'm currently supporting. They are separate teams, but like I said, we do have the whoever's going to be driving the integration part at least participate on the diligence calls. I mean, I've personally led more diligences than I care to remember, more on the
Yeah.
not on the financial side, but operations and IT. I quit counting at 250. So it's been a lot. So I do know due diligence. I think it's a good idea. Again, it just comes down to a skill set thing.
Right.
If your integration manager's got the skill set to also drive the diligence piece, that's great. I do find a lot of times that the true classical corp dev folks that are really good at, doing the analysis and identifying target companies, et cetera, aren't necessarily always the best at operationalizing the deal once it gets done. Again, slightly different skill sets.
Yeah.
But again, if you've got somebody that can play in both worlds, by all means, that would be the ideal situation. Absolutely.
So you've got me now thinking when you are looking at that diligence process, regardless of how involved your integration leader is, they're asking themselves, can our business take in this new work, right? Can we, whether it's transformation, whether it's additive, and they've got to sort out whether or not the business can bring in these new processes, these new people, this new property. And they have to really absorb that without destroying what built the business in the first place. So how do you determine whether the organization can really absorb this new acquisition without eroding the existing performance of the business?
Yeah, no, that's a great thought. And so then I address that as I think I mentioned in that PACE framework. It's literally step 2, right? Step
Okay.
1 is the envision. Step 2 is the assess. And so I believe most companies, unless they're one of those rare breeds that are truly serial acquirers that are doing multiple deals in a year, which most companies are not, that they really do need to have a little bit of a self-reflection, right? I think back to my many years in martial arts, right? One of the core tenets is know thyself, right? First, know thyself. And so I do believe that companies need to take that under advisement as well, right? So making it a concerted part of your diligence process to not just diligence the target company that you're looking to acquire, but reflect on yourself as well, right? Understanding the leadership bandwidth. Does the leadership all buy in that we have to do this deal? Do they have the bandwidth to provide the air cover and the support and whatever governance needs to be put in place? What else is going on? Usually companies are doing more than one thing. So what is the concurrent initiative load, right? Less is better if you're going to do a deal because it's going to touch every part of the business. But understanding where this deal fits in the hierarchy of all the other initiatives that are going on. How's the workforce? Is the workforce ready? How's their change readiness? Is the company dynamic and good with change, or are they a little more stuck in their ways? Those two factors could drive, some additional preparation work or additional uplifts during the integration, right? What I call the functional spine, kind of the management systems of the organization, right? Finance, HR, legal, IT, ops, etc. Are they ready? Do they know how to do this? Do they have experience or not have experience? Again, that just determines the amount of runway you need. It doesn't necessarily mean you don't do the deal. It's just how much runway do you need to give this team in order to prepare? And so there's really kind of a baseline understanding of the business's current health and momentum that should be a part of a truly robust diligence effort. Probably not as detailed as what of the company you're buying, but understanding yourself needs to be part of the process.
Yeah. So let's talk for a moment. You mentioned leadership at first, and the longer I do this work, the more I become convinced that leadership alignment is absolutely critical, not just in terms of, yes, this is a good idea. Yes, this is something we should pursue. Yes, the diligence makes sense, but also the how, right? How we're going to really put this in place. And I think most leadership teams don't really talk about it at that level. I think they operate maybe at a higher level than they should sometimes. So when you look at those leadership teams, where do you see them start to break down in the execution layer, even when the strategy is sound?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's funny. This is a good question too. I was thinking back as you were framing this to a company I worked with many years ago when I was in consulting, and it's consistently played out. And so the issue ultimately for them was we had a company, it was a technology company, and they'd acquired another one of closely the same size. And both had very strong personalities. Both CEOs had very strong personalities. And the integration really stalled because it was very unclear who ultimately had decision rights. And it really came down to decision rights. And so the acquiring company's CEO obviously believed that we bought you guys, so we ultimately get to say yay or nay with your input. We're not going to be dictatorial about it, but ultimately the buck stops here. And the other CEO is like, you're going to erode all the value of this business if you don't listen to me. And they kind of got into a little bit of a little head-to-head match there. And so to me, a lot of times where I see alignment fracture is ensuring that we have very crystal clear ideas of who gets to say yay and nay to what decisions. So it's almost like a decision matrix, right? Who ultimately has the authority and whatnot. I think the other piece, as I mentioned earlier a couple of times now, is culture, right? I think culture also plays a key role in this, right? In terms of understanding how the newly combined entity is going to operate and having that agreed to, at least in principle, between the two leadership teams before the deal closes. I think it's very, very critical. Again, this is kind of all that first step of the planning phase of the PACE framework. encompasses all of this stuff. But, there needs to be an agreement on why are we doing this now, and who's going to ultimately, who ultimately gets to say yes or no to certain decisions, and how are we going to operate in the future, right? In my previous very simple example, is it going to be tops down, or is it going to be more consensus driven? What are we going to do, and how are we going to operate, and make sure that's set at least at the top, because at the end of the day, once that's clear, most of the rest of the organization will follow suit. But if there's disagreement at the very top, there's chaos in the organization. And so I often think back to that one deal. It's like that could have been avoided if we'd had those conversations, even if there needed to be a facilitator involved, facilitate those dialogues early and often, so that when we get to the execution phase, it's we all know which drum we're marching to.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about culture here, Mark. So what are some of the most common sources of friction that you see during integrations, and where do they start to show up? And coupled with that, I know that when you and I have chatted in the past, you've talked about resistance, and it's not necessarily resistance, right? That's just a natural thing, but it's not managing the resistance. So between friction and resistance, how and where do those sorts of things show up, and how do leaders navigate through that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I feel like my daughter's going to be going to university soon for physics. And so you're talking about friction and resistance. I'm like, I feel like I'm in a physics class, but
Right.
yes. So no, look, both topics are clearly interrelated to each other. So in terms of the friction piece, right, I think there it's really what we were just talking about a few minutes ago, right? It's lack of clarity around authority and decision rights, cultural misalignment, and just some of that lack of pre-planning that can cause issues when we get into integration, cause delays, finger pointing, mistakes get made, et cetera. So I think if you can get that alignment early on, that helps considerably with the broader organizational friction. Now, that being said, there's always going to be some. You're never going to have a truly frictionless organization. And if you did, probably wouldn't be a very interesting place to work, right? And so friction's actually a good thing. And so as I mentioned, I think in my book, it's not that resistance is the issue, it's unmanaged resistance that can become an issue. And I've found over the years, I call them naysayers in my book, right? But anybody that's coming from lack of a better word, a negative perspective on this, or pushing back, right? I don't know what a good word is for that. But oftentimes the loudest naysayer can actually be your greatest friend. And I'll tell you this for two reasons. First, I come at this from the mindset that I studied martial arts for 30 plus years. I did Aikido for many, many, many years. And one of the key aspects of Aikido is that you never meet force with force. You manage distance, which is called ma'ai in Japanese, if any of your listeners are curious, the distance between your opponents. Again, not saying your naysayers are opponents, but if you think of it from that perspective, and then you blend with the resistance. So instead of meeting force head on, you blend with it, right? And so you can apply the same thought process to a transformation or to an integration when you're going through this. Rather than fighting the resistance, you embrace it. And so by embracing that, I mean really sitting down with folks and understanding where they're coming from. You don't have to agree with it, nor do you actually have to respond to it. You don't have to address every single point that's raised, but having people feel heard is probably the greatest way of managing the resistance. And then cycling back to them to show them where you have heard them and taken action, or you're not taking action, but this is why we're not taking action, and sharing that with them so they understand it's not just random. I've often seen, unfortunately, leaders take the opposite approach, kind of, push them away or try to shut people down by proving them wrong with facts and data. And that really just solicits more resistance. Again, it's that, it's meeting resistance with resistance, and it's far better to kind of meet them where they're coming from, blend with them, to use the Aikido term, and help them understand why we're doing what we're doing and why we're going to do it their way or not do it their way. Just having that communication is really, really key, I find.
It's a great example. So let's flip the script a little bit. So we've been talking a bit about why things don't work.
Sure.
Let's talk about what makes them work. So as you're working through execution, what are some of those early signs that it is working, that you're actually building value out of this acquisition?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because a lot of people do look at this as, they're trying to figure out what's going wrong. So
Mhm.
I like the fact you phrased it in a positive way. So some things that I would look at to see that it's really working. Are we getting some early wins? Right? Do we see some progress being made? That could be some early wins towards realizing some of the synergies that have been adopted. Right? How is decision making? Decision making is another good one. Are we seeing, especially in the middle management layers, not necessarily executive layers, and the general employee population don't always make like major, but like the middle management, are they making decisions? Are they moving at pace? Has the pace of the organization been maintained in general? Right. And so usually, and the reason I say that is when there's confusion, the organizational friction goes up and the pace of execution slows down because people are nervous, they're scared, they're not sure what to do, there's no sense of direction. So if the decision making is still chugging along, that's usually a good sign that things are moving pretty well. Another area that I would look at is attrition from key talent, not total attrition, but like critical talent. Are they staying with it and on board and excited and continuing to move forward, or are some of them starting to punch out? And again, if they're sticking around and seem to be excited, that's probably another good sign. And then the last area I would say is really around the customers. Very similar. How's customer attrition? Right? If I've seen so many deals where everybody's like, oh, the integration's great, we're doing great. It's like, but they're bleeding customers because the customers see through all that. And they're like, service has dropped, quality has dropped, whatever it is dropped. And so we're now going to leave. So congratulations on the integration or the acquisition, but you've blown the ops, right? And you've blown the operations. So yeah, talent, customers, middle management decision making, and synergy realization. I'd say those are kind of four areas that you can kind of look at to get a quick pulse on whether or not things are going according to plan.
Yeah. Those are great ways to look at it. So, Mark, you've held some interesting positions, right? So you've been an advisor for a while. You're also the person accountable, and I'm sure that shapes how you think about this. So, if you were giving advice to a leader who wants to build as a repeatable capability and not a one-off event, what would you recommend to them, and what are some of the lessons that you've learned sitting on both sides of the table, as it were?
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. Yeah, because I do have the advantage of having spent about half my career in consulting and half in industry, owning it. So I think the first piece I would tell the leader is that if this is a journey, it's not an event. You cannot just snap your fingers overnight and say we're going to be great at deals or do a deal or two and be great. It's a journey. It usually takes a number of deals, and by that I'm meaning like 5 to 10 over a period of a few years to
Yeah.
really get good at this, right? However, there are some things you can do as an organization if you want to go down that path and build that muscle, just like I'd said up front, similar to any other functional muscle. First, I would say hire or appoint a permanent M&A leader, all right? Somebody that's kind of lived it, breathed it, ideally somebody that's got quite a few deals under their belt. This will accelerate the process because they can then bring that knowledge in, create, a playbook for the organization, set up the methodology, the process, the plan. They can get a lot of that kind of jump started, right? Very similar, frankly, what I did with my current company. Second would be to establish or adopt a consistent, repeatable methodology. You can use my PACE framework if you want. I'll give it a plug there, but there's plenty of others out there. But it honestly matters less about which methodology you pick and more important that you pick one and stick with it and be consistent. Build out a diligence model that goes beyond the financials, as we talked about, right? Include those other areas, IT, ops, commercial, HR, culture, etc. And then ensure really good organizational discipline around synergy tracking. So make sure you're very clear up front. Why are you doing the deal? What value we extract? So it's the classic 1 + 1 should equal 3. So how do you get the 3, right? You got the 2, 1 and 1 is 2. Now, how do you get that extra 1? Where's that coming from? And really, really track it. And then the last piece, the fifth piece, I would say that a lot of companies kind of fall down on is really having a robust deal post-mortem. So after every transaction, consistently and rigorously go through what worked and what didn't work and actually use it. Don't just do it for the exercise, but then roll that into the playbook, amend it. So next time you get better and maybe make different mistakes, but try not to make the same mistake. So there's kind of 5 things I would give to a leader if they really wanted to jumpstart that process.
Well, those are absolutely fantastic tips, Mark. So we're near the end of our time together. For listeners who want to connect with you or learn more about your work, whether that's PACE or other parts of your work, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yeah, no, thanks. So I'm a big guy on LinkedIn, so folks can reach me on LinkedIn. Mark Guidi, I think I usually come up as the top on the list. You can also find me at www.markguidi.com. I've got a little website there. And my book, as you mentioned, Transform Leaders Survival Manual to Driving Change in the Age of AI. That's also on Amazon. There's links to it both on my LinkedIn and on my website for anybody that would like a little bedtime reading to learn a little bit more about the methodology and some of the leadership traits. It also goes into some of the leadership traits that would make for a good transformation leader and how to build those traits so that anybody can do that.
Fantastic. And Mark, of course, we'll make sure that all of those end up in the show notes as well. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us and giving such fantastic advice. We really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure, Clint. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Master Your Merger, hosted by Clint Kendrick. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you found this valuable, share it with someone leading through a deal. To explore toolkits, resources, and upcoming programs, including our free roundtables, visit masteryourmerger.com. We'll see you next time.